Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Public Square, your weekly current affairs show coming to you on Meri Online channel. This coming Monday, 30th September, Botswana will be celebrating its 58th anniversary of independence. The former British protectorate attained self-rule in 1965. And in 1966, the country gained full independence. This week, the Public Square takes you on a journey from right at the time when the various Botswana communities were coexisting as separate, independent nation states up until 1966, when the nation state called Botswana was formed. In the studio, I am with Dr. Jeff Ramsay, a preeminent scholar, historian, prolific writer, who is going to talk to us about the developments leading to independence in 1966. Welcome to the Public Square, Dr. Ramsay.
It's wonderful to be here.
It's also very nice to have you. This is where I want to start, Dr. Ramsay. The period between 1800 and 1850 was characterized by military conflict and migration in Southern Africa as a result of the wars of the Fatani and the Boer track. How were the various Tswana communities affected by this in terms of how they related with each other, but also how they dealt with external threat?
Yes, I think when we look at the roots of Botswana as a modern nation state, I think this is where it is indeed best to begin. Because that period of turmoil, or the Difakani, some people there is this myth about the red ants and the black ants, at least in Sequena. And the black ants are associated with the Amandabili and the Makololo who came, and then subsequently the Boers and even the British. The challenges of responding to these folks created what I would say was the transformation in the mid-19th century of Botswana communities, the consolidation of kingdoms around certain rulers like Sechele, Lethuletebe, Hasitsiwe, Sekoma, and later his son Kama. And in this context, it also was transformative of the economy and of religion and ideology. It happened to coincide with the arrival of the missionaries, bringing the gospel. And among the first missionaries were Moffat and later his son-in-law, Livingston. And part of the somewhat secret history or less known history of Botswana is their role in facilitating the arms trade into this region. The other aspect that encouraged the arms trade in this region was ivory. Ivory trade was huge in the mid-1800s, and it allowed rulers like Sechele to trade ivory for arms. So that by 1850, Sechele in particular, but quickly followed by Sekoma and others, were acquiring significant arsenals, including the famous cannon in Mahikeng and some very powerful guns. Now, these very powerful guns had to be used to hunt the elephants themselves. They were rifled so they could fire 1,000 yards when the typical military musket of that era was only 60 yards. They had heavy shot to bring down an elephant or a rhinoceros. So this trade led to the situation where Sechele's Bakwena, the Bangwaketsi of Hasitsiwe, before that the Sebeho and others, and Sekoma the first in Hamangwato, and Lethuletebe in Hatoana, became something of protectors. I'm cautious because, there's all kind of ethnic issues. But the truth is that there is a map there's many maps, but one I would cite by Dr. Hullop that predates the colonial era. And it shows Khama's kingdom, Seychelle's kingdom, Hasatsiwe's kingdom. And this map is in both English, but there was also a German version, and it says Khama Reich, Seychelle Reich. Now, kingdom, of course, speaks for itself. This shows European recognition of a high political state in the region. Reich in German is a very powerful word. Most people might think of the Third Reich and Hitler's use. So it's a very strong word in German for state. And you have this situation in this map where these kingdoms, including the Batlaping kingdom and Manchiwa, the Baralang kingdom, are all shown in green because they're also shown to be associated with one another. So even though they were separate polities, they were understood to be in alliance. And separately, you see Lobangula's kingdom, Lewanika's kingdom, that is the Bolozi, the Amandabili. So I think that's significant too, because that and many other maps of the time show a Botswana that's somewhat similar to our boundaries today. And in particular, our boundary with South Africa along what we used to call the Transvaal, on the Limpopo and Notwani rivers, it hasn't changed since 1852. So some people say, well, the British just drew lines on the map. They drew some lines. But probably the most important boundary we have was a product not of the British, but of a war. In 1852-53, the Transvaal Boers invaded what we know as Botswana today. And the Marafi united under the leadership of Seychelle, but including all of the other Dikosi. And there was the Battle of Dimawe and subsequent engagements at Kanye. And then most of the war, because it went on for 6 months of hot warfare, was when Botswana invaded what's today South Africa. And
actually, just hold it there, Jeff, because I want to go back to the 1852 war between the Boers and Bakwena and the other Botswana Merafi. What was the significance of that war, especially in terms of cooperation between these various Botswana ethnic groups going forward?
Well, yes, it's the seeds of the modern nation for various reasons. First and foremost, the Marafi united, and because they not only united, but they were armed, and they were among the first groups, along with the Basotho, to face white settlers in the region with large amounts of guns. Most of Seychelle's and Sentufe was then the region of the Bangwaketse. They had modern weapons. So when they were fighting the Boers, they were having an artillery duel, and they were shooting with similar levels of guns. So we all remember that, or we may be aware of that the Boers had easily crushed the Zulu, despite Zulu numbers, Zulu discipline, Zulu bravery, at what's called Blood River, simply because it was guns against assegai. But at Dimawe, it was gun against gun. The actual battle was a standoff. But then the second phase of the war was when more Marafi start joining it up, and it becomes what today we would know as guerrilla warfare, because when the Botswana invaded what's today South Africa, the Boers went into lager, just as they had done earlier with the Zulu. But the Botswana didn't attack the lager. They went and burned the farms, grabbed the cattle, and to the point where the Boers had to push back to what today we know as Potchefstroom and Rustenburg. So first and foremost, it showed that Botswana, by uniting, could win and could protect their independence. But many groups who had been in South Africa also migrated into Botswana. So we have the Balete, the Bakatla Bahamanana, Baharutsi, and others. Some would go back. Some would split themselves on both sides of the border, like Bakatla Bahakafela and some of the Baharutsi groups. So when we look even at the demography, particularly of Southeast Botswana today, we look at not just Mule Polole and Kanye, but Mashupa, Tamaha, Rabani, Mankodi, Manyana. These are villages that were created in the aftermath of that war. Even the Batlokwa were part of the struggle, Balete, Baralong were part of the struggle as well, and Bangwato. In the case of the Baralong, they were very much associated with the alliance. So it's only with the colonial era that the Baralong as well as the Batlaping are separated to some degree. Of course, we have Baralong on our side of the border as well, from their traditional allied partners in what's today Botswana.
That's right. And it's actually interesting, Dr. Ramsay, that even after the war, in which the Bakwena and the other Botswana groups were victorious in pushing back the Boers, the threats were still there. And the British were in the Cape Colony, the Cape. And actually some of the Botswana tribes, you referred to the Rolong, for instance, and the Taping, just south of the Molopo River. Because of this threat, they were making appeals to the British to come and come to their assistance. But the British were not interested. They were reluctant. What made the British change their attitude later, say in the 1880s, and want to extend their influence over the Tswana tribes?
Yeah, it's, to make a long story short, we can go straight to the Congress of Berlin in 1884 and 85. Bismarck had summoned European powers and others there to make rules about what becomes very quickly the scramble for Africa. And not all the boundaries were drawn in Berlin, but it just so happens that there was a lot of side meetings. And among those side meetings were between the Germans and the British, because the Germans announced during this conference, before and during the conference, that they were moving into what's today Namibia. And the British immediately responded to that by proclaiming a protectorate, first over Botswana, south of the Molopo, then up through halfway up to what's today Botswana, or 60% of what's today Botswana. They actually announced that they consider themselves having a sphere of influence over all of what we today know as Botswana. But the Germans countered by making claims to Ngamiland. So those boundaries were not resolved at Berlin. In fact, they only get resolved in 1890. That is 5 years after the British had established formal control over the southern half plus of today's Botswana. So it was direct result of the scramble for Africa, and really nothing more nor less. I mean, there are details on the ground. The British clearly saw that if they didn't take Botswana, the Germans could link up with the Transvaal and also move into what's today Zimbabwe, which is exactly what the Germans were trying to do at the time. In fact, when Warren came up with a military expedition here to Botswana to announce the protectorate, there was a German expedition from what's today Namibia going through northern Botswana. It ended up in Shoshong and then in the Transvaal, a smaller expedition. But the Germans and the British didn't clash. They instead negotiated what we know as the boundaries today between Botswana and Namibia.
Good. So the protectorate is then declared in 1885.
Yes.
Over the Botswana tribes. How was that received by the Dikhosi in those territories?
In various ways, because Khama welcomed it, but perhaps thinking that was the best strategy. Sechele was a little bit ambivalent, but he finally accepted it with some qualifications that basically he would continue to run his own affairs. His son Sibili was adamantly opposed. And really that's where it ends. Others were talked to, but they were not, when Warren came up, they considered to be two big kings that they had to negotiate with, Khama and Sechele. People might not like that, but That was the British perception of the ones they had to try to pull in. Now, Sechele had earlier indicated that he could not really fight the British. We have that in other sources. He knew the military power of the British, but also not only did he know it from just his contacts with the British, he was very familiar with some British military officers and the likes. But also he had watched what had happened to the Batlaping when the British decided to seize first the diamond fields around Kimberley, and then later on expand their territory elsewhere. I mean, most of that land, the land that was the original diamond country, was Batlaping. But they called it Griqua land, and then they grabbed it. And when the Batlaping rose up, they were brutalized. They were, the British used Maxim guns and everything. It was the amount of Batlaping who were killed by the British greatly exceeds what the Boers had done to Botswana during the earlier war.
That's good. Let's hold it there, and we'll continue our conversation on the other side of the break. We are in conversation with Dr. Jeff Ramsay this week on the Public Square, and we are talking about the birth of the Botswana nation. We'll continue the conversation on the other side of the break. If you are just joining us, we are on the Public Square, and this week we are in conversation with Dr. Jeff Ramsay, well-known historian in Botswana. Dr. Ramsay, you pointed out that the reception towards protectorate was varied among the various communities. Now, I'm reminded that actually in 1889, there was this big conference that was held in Kopong, known as the Kopong Conference, where the chiefs from the various tribes met with British officials. In particular, I think it was Sydney Shepherd.
Sydney Shepherd, otherwise known as Morena Ma'aka.
Morena Ma'aka. And it is interesting that actually at this conference, it became very clear that the relationship between the respective Khosi of the various tribes, the relationship with the British administration was not always cordial. But rather the Bangwaketse Khosi and the Bakwena Khosi made it very clear to Shepherd that they didn't want British rule. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to restore their independence. What was the outcome of the conference? Especially that it became clear that now the relationship was not very good.
Yeah, to quickly put it into context, Sydney Shepherd, or Morena Ma'aka, was really the instrument of Cecil Rhodes. And already, in the first months, even years of the protectorate, the British had a light touch, you might say. It wasn't clear. They had blocked the Germans, but their interests were not so clear. Rhodes, on the other hand, had very long-term interests. He saw Botswana, as we know it today, as a stepping stone to Zimbabwe and other places. So he got his charter in 1889, the British South Africa Company, which was to include today's Botswana, as well as Zimbabwe, Zambia, as we know them today. And with him coming in, all sorts of new demands were also being imposed on the Dikosi and the people of Botswana. demands that they, rules were going in that trading would be controlled by the British. There was pressure for tax, although it came ultimately later. And Sibili had some particular run-ins with the British administration, and these run-ins also led the British to create the police presence, paramilitary police presence at the time in today's Gaborone, the village section of Gaborone to be specific about it. And that was specifically to keep an eye on what they called the turbulent chiefs, who were Linswe, Sibili, and Batwain. And these Dikosi, they had, of course, in some cases been educated in South Africa. They were literate, unlike their fathers or grandfathers, depending on who we're talking about. They were suspicious of Rhodes from the beginning. They also had advisors from the outside, as well as educated Africans who were giving them information. So at Kopong, it was actually Sibili who proposed that everybody meet at Kopong. And Shippard embraced this as the idea that he would be able to get them all together and tell them, read them the riot act, so to speak, about now we're going into a real British type of rule. And you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And it was the first time all the Dikosi came together. And this time when we're talking about Dikosi, we're even talking about Bakatla, Bahamanana, Balete, Batlokwa, all the Marafi of eastern Botswana. So Kama was there as well as Batwain, Sibili, Linswe, and the likes. And it was in the context of Shippard making this demands that all of the Dikosi, with the exception of Kama, started talking about independence, or we can pull out of this protection. Now, I don't think they thought that that would necessarily happen, because they'd already had some confrontations with the British. But at least they put that on record. And it's also important because at that point, the Marafi once more start to work together. And eventually the Bangwata will join them. And they start to work together. Even Linswe and Sibili, you might know, they had clashed earlier. There had been a little war between Bakatla and Bakwena. But now they're working together because they can see they have a common threat or enemy. And in this cooperation, they begin to clarify. They start making concessions that guarantee them the legal status of sovereigns of the soil in their own territories. Even to the point that Linswe, of course, says, I'm not Bakwena, but when it came to protecting his territory, he was willing to join hands with Sibili. So that is the context to that, and it was a shock to the British. Now, Shippard, on behalf of Rhodes, was always looking for a military confrontation. He actually hoped to start a war down here. But fortunately, people in London kept staying his hand. So, we could have had something like what had happened to the Batlaping. But at the same time, when I say fortunately, people in London were staying their hand, but people like Sibili and Linswe and the likes were trying to also avoid confrontation, because unless there was no choice, they knew what the outcome would be.
That's interesting. Now, the big one.
Yes.
1895.
Yes.
The three, the Khosi Sibili, the first of Bakwena, Khosi Batwing, and Khosi Khama, the third of Bangwatu, traveled to England. Now, there is so much urban legend about the visit to England. What we do know is that, as you said, there was now this real threat from the British South Africa Company of Cecil John Rhodes. Now, what really happened in England, and what was the outcome of the visit of the three Dikosi?
It's very important, both symbolically and for what really happened. In the aftermath of the conquest of the Amandabele by Rhodes's people in 1893, Kama himself began to understand also the dangers of roads. And he reached out after some period of estrangement to Batwain and Sabili, who were, of course, related to him in many ways. They had grown up together at various times. And they had the London Missionary Society in common. Now, in 1895, it just happened that the London Missionary Society was celebrating its centenary, its 100th anniversary. So they got invitations to that. And in fact, they encouraged those invitations because they began to think that the only way to stop Rhodes, who now had announced by the beginning of 1895 that it's time for him to also take over today's Botswana. And obviously, the Dikosi didn't want this. The other Kosi who went with them, although he was not quite Kosi yet, was the son of Mansiwa, the Baralang. Because at the same time Botswana was supposed to be transferred to the British South Africa Company, all the land south of the Malopo, which had been called British Botswanaland, but had been administered separately since September 30th, 1885, they were to be incorporated into the Cape Colony, which is why today they're part of the Republic of South Africa. So the Dikosi decide that the only way to get around this is let's use this invitation from the London Missionary Society to go to Britain. And they were encouraged by the missionaries and others to lobby against the transfer of the protectorate to the direct rule of Cecil Rhodes. Unbeknownst to them, at least at the beginning, was that Rhodes also wanted the territory rapidly because he wanted to use it as a springboard for a plan he had to overthrow the government of the Transvaal, the Boer government of Paul Kruger, and seize the gold fields politically as well as economically in the Rand. So the Dikosi go and they leave in August. They arrive in Britain in September. They only leave Britain at the end of November, so they arrive back here just before Christmas, all in 1895. So they're in Britain for 3 months. They get to Britain. Chamberlain agrees to see them, except he won't see Basele. The Baralang are locked out of this process. Because of that, I should say Basele leaves early. At the end of September, he leaves. Because by this time, they had two demands. One is the protectorate stay under British rule, and British Botswanaland, or at least the Baralang, become part of the protectorate, or at least stay out of the Cape Colony. In the light of what was going on, the Cape Colony thing was fast-tracked. And ultimately, the Baralang and Basele say that they're wasting their time. They're not going to be listened to. Chamberlain tells the Dikosi he's going off on a holiday, which he did, come back. Well, he encouraged them to negotiate with Rhodes, but they've already tried to negotiate with Rhodes. They know that's not going to work. So instead, they tour not just England, but Wales and Scotland. They go to virtually every major town and even some not so major towns in Britain. And they get huge crowds because different groups were sponsoring them. The London Missionary Society had its big centenaries and other churches were joining with them. The Temperance Union, which is people against alcohol, were welcoming Kama. And Batwain was, by the way, a teetotaler. Sabili wasn't, but he was while he was in Britain. He knew he had to be. And he didn't cheat. So they were going to temperance things, arguing that Rhodes would bring in liquor shops and likes. They were going to the London Missionary Society, reminding people of their Livingston connection, that they were all presented as model Christian rulers who were loyal to the British. They were also, though, getting other political groups like early socialists and the likes, and even some of the imperialists, which is their old adversary or frenemy. Warren welcomed them. General Warren, he was by now, a senior general and was becoming the police chief of London. But many imperialists also didn't like Rhodes in London. So they were able to assemble a coalition, get lots of newspaper coverage, and in those days, print media was the media. And so they created a big noise. Now, as they created this big noise, it became problematic for Rhodes. It was casting too much light, unbeknownst to them, except they might have learned it somewhere along the way. Chamberlain and Rhodes were plotting this thing where Rhodes British South Africa Company forces and Botswana paramilitary police would be merged together, and under the leadership of Jameson, who had been the one who had put down the Amandabile, at least in part, they would invade the Transvaal. An uprising would happen in Johannesburg. This is the so-called Jameson Raid. Now, so they promised the Dikosi some questionable promises. They said to Batwain, Sibili, and Kama, your territories can remain under Britain. Now, this is what the Botswana themselves and their missionary friends called this a half-loaf, because they realized they hadn't really protected their neighbors. And they were savvy enough to know that this is a very uncertain sort of a thing, even for them. So they came back, they were met by huge cheering crowds, but they were a little bit reluctant until after the Jameson raid to confirm. But then they had met the Queen. She was not, she was more a courtesy call, is what we call them in diplomatic thing, but they had met her. In the aftermath of the Jameson raid, Rhodes's political capital was gone. The imperialist faction in London, who didn't want him to take over this, the protectorate anyway, now were able to push him out. It was a huge international as well as British scandal. So the political interests of Rhodes, but not his economic interests in Botswana, disappeared overnight. In the meantime, Rotsosa and others, Rotsosa was then the tribal secretary of Kama, are now talking about the promises they got from the Queen to protect them. And these promises become the genesis of the myth we have of the chiefs going and getting protection from Mamo Sadinyana, a term that I believe Sibili coined. But they were all very savvy with the media. And when the threat of the Union of South Africa taking in Botswana from 1908 to 1910, South Africa was being negotiated, Sibili and Batwain revived this notion. There was a huge meeting in Gaborone, Pitso, with most of the Marafi, though they met Kama separately up north. And they had some rings. They had actually gotten them in Britain, but they gave speeches about how they had been promised protection by the Queen. First, Sibili said this. Then Batwain got up, and he said, on my hand, I have this ring. This ring was given to me by Mamo Sadinyana. As you know, with these Makoa, a ring is a symbol of marriage. It's a symbol of our marriage to Britain. Okay. And then he says, Sibili, do you have your ring? And Sibili puts up his ring, and the crowd cheers. And we know this to be true, because not only do we have the British transcript of the meeting, but then Sibili and Batwain have their agent, Gerrans, in Britain, get it published in the London Times, the biggest newspaper. Front page, the transcript of all of this.
Wow. Okay, let's hold it there. We are in conversation with Dr. Ramsay. We'll continue with him on the other side of the break. Just joining us, we are on the public square, and we are in conversation this week with Dr. Jeff Ramsay. Welcome back, Dr. Ramsay. When we went for the break, you were still in the process of dispelling this myth surrounding the visit of the Dikosi to England. Can you just conclude on that?
Yeah. Well, of course, the first thing to note is it was in 1895. So that's 10 years plus after the actual imposition of protectorate, which basically means British occupation. Secondly, the Dikosi did have a very important political mission, though. It was to try to prevent the transfer of Botswana, as we know it today, to the British South Africa Company control, who, of course, were already ruling and misruling grievously today's Zimbabwe and Zambia. So that is why they went. And as I said, when they ended their mission, they were not 100% confident that they had succeeded, because they knew Rhodes was now already taking over Balete, Baralango farms, claiming Machudi and the likes. However, with the failure of the Jameson raid, their half loaf became a whole loaf. And they were able thereafter to use this. Now, their people were already excited that they had seen the Queen in lights, and now they're saying, yes, indeed, we have this promise of protection from the Briton, all the way the Queen herself, Mamo Sarinyana, the little queen, the great white queen, has. And it also gave this situation where Botswana royalty start to associate themselves with promises and legacies to the British royalty. So this is the cards that thereafter Sibili and Batwain in particular play when they're trying to fight the incorporation of Botswana in 1908, 9, 10 into the Union of South Africa, which was formed in 1910. But they sent agents to be part of the Colored and Native Peoples delegation in 1909 to Britain. These people included all the people who would later make the ANC, the organizations, that is. And that mission had twofold mission. Insist on blacks having the vote, because the Constitution of the Union of South Africa before British Parliament was white suffrage and white representation, virtually only with very small little footnotes. Secondly, it was to keep the protectorates out of the Union of South Africa. The second part worked. In Parliament, it didn't work in the sense that the British did have a schedule in the Union of South Africa Act, as they called it, which would provide for the ultimate incorporation, or rules for the ultimate potential incorporation of Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho into the Union, and indeed what today we know as Zimbabwe even. But it was put off, and in Parliament the camp even got it was raised by Keir Hardie, who is one of the founders of the Labour Party. He got the Secretary of State, that is the Colonial Secretary, to promise that any incorporation should take on board the views of the natives, that is the indigenous population. So this was an important political victory, but it wasn't a final victory. It was a battle in a long war, a war to keep Botswana out of the Union of South Africa. And there was also Rhodesia, once it becomes self-governing after World War I, starts to make claims to northern Botswana as well. So there is a Rhodesian threat as well as a Union of South Africa threat. And in that context, the myth that, I would call it a myth, or at least the narrative, that Botswana had gone and gotten promises of protection from the Queen becomes a very powerful counter-narrative to incorporation. So every time British, whereas the High Commissioner, the Resident Commissioner, or even better when like the Prince of Wales comes and other British royals comes, there's many meetings in the 20s and the 30s when the British royalty would come through. They would have these sessions. They would always make speeches that reaffirming their commitment to the promises made by Mama Sarinyana to their fathers, their grandfathers, depending on the time frame. So even Dikosi, like Sibili II, who didn't have the best relations with the British, but he would talk about the special relation that his grandfather Sibili had made with Mamo Sarinyana that he cherished, which is why he had fought in the war. And you know, that was the narrative being put out. And the thing was, it was a unifying narrative. You might think, well, it's just something for Bakwena or Bangwato or Bangwaketsi, but other groups, Bakarutsi, even Bakalanga, they were accepting the narrative because it was bringing together people. And one thing that united everybody would unite Sekedi, even with Mshwajwi or Simon Rasosa, two of his nemesis, or Habuamang, even with Batwain II. What everybody agreed to almost, there was a huge consensus in the territory that we don't want Botswana Land Protectorate to become part of either of these white settler places. We will lose our land, we will lose our rights. Now, the rights under the British Protectorate were circumscribed, it's true. But the situation here, particularly when you talk about land rights, was much better than across the border. So K.T. Mosetti was a longtime critic of, for example, of Sekedi, and of course a pioneer nationalist, and so was L.D. Radaklade. But when it comes to this narrative, everybody was singing from the same page. And that's why the narrative has been so important. It survived independence. Some people might say, but this isn't quite true, because it's also been conflated to believe that even the protectorate itself had come out of the chiefs asking for protection, later on as protection from the Boers. But that's when the Union of South Africa gets conflated with Boers. Which also begins to happen in the 1920s, because the Herzog regime, which was the first Afrikaner nationalist government, even before the more modern one, post-World War II, did begin to push for incorporation. And Sekedi Khama, I would call the leader at this point, but all the Dikosi rally with Sekedi Khama often being the chairman, so to speak. They do any number of things to try to block incorporation. And perhaps the most dramatic thing they did, besides committing themselves, first of all, when World War II broke out, they absolutely refused to allow their people to fight in the South African army, or being part of the South African army. The South Africans, at any rate, just wanted them for labor, and they had experienced that in World War I. But once the British agree, because the war starts to go against them, to have a separate Botswana, they come in huge numbers into what becomes the African Pioneer Corps. After that war, they do have a remarkable thing where they combine with the Herero leadership initially in both Botswana, the exiled leadership, and in Southwest Africa, as it was then, today's Namibia, to challenge Namibia had been a mandate, League of Nations mandate of the Union of South Africa. So after the war, Smuts wanted to annex it. But they go to the UN. They try to go physically to the UN, but they're blocked by the British and the South Africans. But they get agents to the UN, and they get the Indian government, the emerging Indian government, which already had representation in the United Nations, to take up their cause. And they make this remarkable document where they insert that Bechuanaland Protectorate is a sovereign entity that has standing in the United Nations, so that it can address the issue of Southwest Africa. And of course, they don't want Southwest Africa to be incorporated into South Africa. They see that as another step towards their own incorporation, but if they can block them, then that strengthens their hands. And in the case of Sekedi, he's also looking at, let's have a railway to Walvis Bay, and this could be, a ultimately independent, but what they had hoped in the short term is a British protectorate in Namibia can combine with a British protectorate in Botswana. Maybe they'd remain different territories, but they would work together as a counterweight to the new, what would soon become the apartheid regime in South Africa.
That's interesting. Actually, you mentioned the Second World War, but also the nationalists who were emerging in Botswana. You actually mentioned someone like Ramo Mutsete. This is my question. It is quite interesting, or even maybe ironic, that Botswana generally appeared to have been content to be under British control. Even after the World War II, while other Africans elsewhere on the continent were agitating against colonial rule, and there was clamor for liberation, Botswana still acquiesced with the British for continued rule. Why was that the case?
I think it's the issue we've just been talking about, the threat of incorporation. They had spent, and that is why they kept reaffirming what we might call the royal marriage between the British monarchy and the kingdoms as they saw them, that they were here in Botswana. And yet, we can't say they, what we were just talking about, they were the first Africans to get their voice into the UN and assert their sovereignty. not including Ethiopia and Liberia and the likes, but I mean in the colonial Africa. So I would argue that when you talk about Sekedi and Batwain and Sibili II, but also even Mshwashini, like these were people who were very independent-minded, and they had many complaints about the British. They were acquiescing at a certain level. But particularly when we look at Sekedi Kama, we know he had so many clashes with the British. So they were negotiating the terms. So to make a long story short, when could nationalism transform itself into a demand for independence for Botswana? Really not until the mid-50s. It was in the mid-50s with the apartheid regime consolidating itself, beginning to become an international pariah, and certainly on the international scope. Many countries are coming out. Not all countries came out at the same time. You have people who are both sides of the border, like Z.K. Matthews, who was the first black South African to speak at the UN, who's also championing things and is working with people like both Sekedi Kama and later his nephew Seretse Kama. And you have so many Botswana involved in politics on both sides of the border, like Mutsamayimpo, Matante, Mozete, Fishkitsing, later on Dinake and the likes. So the nationalists are there, but in the mid-50s, it's time where they can really move towards political parties demanding independence. LD Radikladi is the first off the mark, but then we get the BPP and later the BDP. But this happens after Churchill has made a statement in Parliament. One of his last statements, he came back briefly in power in the 50s, to say that the South Africans basically should knock it off. Now that still didn't end the threat, but that plus the winds of change in Africa. And Macmillan did come down. Before he went to South Africa to make that famous speech, he came and met the political leadership, the Batwain and others, but also the then white people like Haskins and Russell England and the likes. And he had that message to them, that politics can move forward. It also was finally the British agreed to have the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council was an imperfect mechanism, but it was a stepping stone later to a more proper one person, one vote dispensation. And it began to create a political climate. The elections for the Africa Council, which were much more democratic, became very important. That's when the nationalists first flexed their muscles. And that's where you get people like Kwet Masiri and others, as well as some of these old royalists emerging. So you begin to get some of the commoners in. So my view is that nationalist political party could gain traction and also have the confidence to push the agenda once they believed that independence outside South Africa was possible. An interesting thing too is that in 1963, Verwoerd said, South Africa no longer want to claim. But he said this in a double-edged way, because what the South Africans by now are hoping is not that they'll take over Botswana per se, but that they would take it over as part of their plans for Bantustans. The apartheid idea that they'll give some land to Africans while retaining most of the land. Now, we know some of maybe not all your young people, but some will remember Bophuthatswana, which was supposed to be the Tswana homeland in South Africa, which even had claimed it had independence, so nobody recognized it but the South Africans. They looked at creating a bigger Bophuthatswana with parts of Botswana, and also a Bushman land, which the Central Kalahari was going to be maybe part of. And so they had a thing called the Tomlinson Report and a plan for Bantustan. So now they're claiming we don't want these places, we want them independent. So it was in that context that Verwoerd did acknowledge by 1963, and they published this, that they would not claim Botswana Land Protectorate, Lesotho or Swaziland, Eswatini. So here again, but by that time the nationalist parties were already on the march.
Right. Good. Let's hold it there. We'll continue on the other side of the break. We are in conversation with Dr. Ramsay. We are going to take a short break and then continue with him again on the other side of the break. If you are just joining, we are on the public square. This week, our guest is Dr. Ramsay. Welcome back, Dr. Ramsay. You touched on the Legislative Council, which was established in 1959?
Yeah, 59 was when it was agreed to, though it only really comes online in 61.
In 61, very good. And it actually, as you said, it basically did the preparatory work that led to the establishment of the democratic state. But then in 1963, there was the constitutional talks,
Yes.
kind of meeting, conference, whatever, which was held in Lobatse. And by now, again, as you said, the issue of incorporation into South Africa had been settled. It was no longer on the table. And at the constitutional talks in Lobatse in 1963, the decision was also made that Bechuanaland Protectorate would become an independent state in the near future. Now, my question, how did the process unfold, that is the constitutional talks, vis-a-vis the various stakeholders involved, namely the chiefs, the Botswana elites who were represented, and the nationalist political leaders, leading to, of course, self-rule and then independence in 1966?
Oh, yes. By the late 50s, with everybody now seeing the possibility of a future independent Botswana, the argument became what type of Botswana. Some of the Dikosi wanted to, of course, retain their power. Some of them, as well as political leaders like Radatlati, thought of a tribal federation as a model. Even earlier, Sekedi and others had talked about a federated African authority as a way to get around British objections to LegCo. So what the LegCo process proved to be is a good forum for the reconciliation of various interests, including, of course, there was still, although they were a minority, there were white settlers, some of whom wanted to join up with South Africa or Rhodesia, if we talk about people in Francistown, South African people, particularly in Hansi, Lobatse. So how do you reconcile the Dikosi, the emerging more radical nationalists, many of the new men who are in between? Do we have a unitary state or a federal state? How do we reconcile white and black and even Asian interests? So it provided a mechanism for this. And a lot of the preparation that enables the Constitutional Conference to come together in Lobatse and reach a consensus, not necessarily easily, but they do, is that there was already lots of consultation going on with these communities, both between themselves and with the British communities or stakeholders. Now, some people will say not everybody was involved. That's very true. But many more people were involved, particularly because you have the BPP and the BDP emerging as mass political movements. And of course, the BPP splits, so you have, by the time we get to Lobatse, two PPPs at the table. I think the British then resident commissioner, Peter Falkus, was very wise in how he handled this, in that he figured the best way to get things forward is to include everybody among the recognized stakeholders. Of course, another thing is happening too, particularly after the massacre at Sharpsville in 1960, you get massive numbers of South African refugees passing through here, including Oliver Tambo, Mandela, pretty much a who's who, as well as other refugees like Samora Machel from Mozambique. In fact, almost every liberation leader that we can think of at one point or another came through Botswana. So Botswana has also become an international fulcrum because it's the place in the center of southern Africa where refugees can escape. But it also means that you have these people are feeding off, to a certain degree, the nationalist movement here, particularly the BPP, but even the BDP people are providing support. I mean, Oliver Tambo was given refuge in Soroe before he could fly out. Lobotse was too dangerous. And that refuge was, he went to see Seretse, who then turned him over to his cousin Lenyeletse to hide him and make sure he was secure, for example. So you're getting Botswana also, even as political conflicts are happening in a party political type of way, there's also some coming together the nation in what became known as the refugee pipeline, which is also bringing lots of new people in here and circulating ideas, and also putting a lot of international attention on what's then Botswana Land Protectorate, soon to be Botswana. Anyway, to get to Lobotse, some people think the British just imposed the Constitution. Professor Bojosi, in particular, has debunked that. There was serious negotiations. There was many models that were put forward. Of course, the British were putting forward models within their Westminster system, which were not objected to. But there was no single model because by now Britain had negotiated constitutions across quite a few Asian and African countries. And there were big issues. The biggest debate was the role of Dikosi. And the compromise, even though later on Batwain believed that he had made a mistake in this compromise, was the House of Chiefs, today's Intlo ya Dikosi. The fact that at one point Matanti might have liked to walk out of Lobotse. Of course, he does later walk out of London. But he couldn't really because, first of all, the British agreed to the demand for independence and the demand for one person, one vote, even with female suffrage. I don't think Matanti thought that would happen. He thought that, well, like other territories, maybe the whites would have special privileges like they had under the Legco Constitution. But by now, the whites have reconciled. And when I say the whites, not all the whites, but the whites who are taking part in this process. And another thing that happened is when South Africa became a republic, it was pushed out of the Commonwealth. And the British ruled that you could either be on this side, well, you could be on the side of the border, but to have political rights in Botswana Land Protectorate, you had to be a Commonwealth citizen. So quite a few whites who are of South African inclination fall away. But already the major leaders like Russell Englund, Haskins, we can go back to earlier ones, they were already aligning themselves to the notion of one person, one vote, a non-racial future for Botswana. So the whites and the nationalists and the Dikosi all ultimately do sign on to the framework of the Constitution we even have today. A self-governing Botswana with a parliament. Initially, you have a prime minister and the head of state role is played by the British Governor General. And it's self-governing, it's still under the British flag. The British are in charge of foreign policy at this point. So this constitution is agreed to in 63, but it only gets implemented fully in March of 65 when we have our first elections. Between then, there was organization for elections, but there was also the need to move the capital from Mahikeng, where it had been, to Gaborone. So all these things, there's so little infrastructure here, in fact, that the British might have been willing to go out even earlier. But we had to build a capital, we had to create a more proper radio station. We had to do so many things, get Z.K. Matthews to help us create a foreign service. So many, many steps. It was a very busy time. There's several books about it, including one by Fawkes himself, his version from the British colonial version of this, but you know, Sir Ketamili Masiri and others have written about this in some detail. So that is the movement towards independence. The elections are held, and of course we know that Seretse, BDP won overwhelmingly in the first election, partially because the BPP were split, but I think mostly because they had managed to get most of the young, educated Botswana, particularly in the rural areas, behind them. Masiri had gone all over the country and had recruited others to go all over the country, recruiting candidates in every constituency, usually teachers or shopkeepers or people of some substance in the community, which meant that much of the BP support was in Francistown. There was support in Machuti and in Lobatse and the likes, but the BDP did win overwhelmingly. Now, at the same time, while there was, again, political division, there was still this sense of nationalism, despite political rhetoric, which we even have today. There's so many things that they end up agreeing on. At the time, they even had a holiday called Protectorate Day, which was becoming increasingly popular. It had started at Batwain's suggestion and had been adopted by first the JC and then LegCo. It was being celebrated on September 30th every day. Why September 30th? It's kind of a historical mistake, but it was on September 30th, 1885, that the British Bechuanaland colony and the British Bechuanaland protectorate had been separated. But in the literature, it was seen as the birth of Bechuanaland protectorate. And it was associated again with the myth of Mamosad and Yana and the likes. But be that as it may about debunking myths, it's interesting that it was on September 30th and that it was becoming popular as a national day. So that you even have a young, at the time, somewhat radical student named Festus Mahai, my future boss. He's, among these young people who've been sent on bursaries to create a core of people who are going to help run this country. And he, writing in Coltuano in 1964, actually advocates that Protectorate Day should be preserved after independence. And when they're looking for a date for independence, there we have it. It's not really a coincidence.
It's not a coincidence.
It's a convenience.
It's a convenience. That is so interesting. Now, before we close, you spoke at length about the constitution-making process. We just had what was supposed to be an amendment, what was meant to become an amendment of the Constitution of Botswana recently. Of course, it could not go through Parliament. Would you say there were any lessons that one could have learned from that process back then, which maybe could have been
I think so.
used now?
Now, it's true that back then wasn't as inclusive as it would be today. And one can understand how different ethnic groups, communities, others might say we weren't involved, we weren't the core stakeholders. Though, if we look at it a little more closely, you have Impo, a lot of his support was from the YA, for example. Musete was there and Matante, who were not necessarily, well, Musete at least was Batalaote, and Matante had a lot of support from Kalanga people. So I think when you contextualize it to its time, at least, it was quite inclusive. And it didn't happen overnight. By the time we get the meetings, which still lasted days and weeks, and even after the meetings, there still had to be further, after the Constitution talks, actually, Linswe and Batwain began to wonder about the House of Chiefs. They still had to have further talks with them to bring them on board. So it was in this context, I would say, for the time, it was an inclusive process. And while we would have to have a different structure today, if we're going to have, if we're going to open this door again, definitely, I think they were very good about making sure that they had the agreement so that when they got to the British and later, our parliament would be obviously the sovereign body and the people of Botswana, because many constitutional amendments do require under our current constitution a referendum. Definitely when you're playing with the Constitution, it's very sensitive. The more buy-in you have, the better. So without being partisan about it, I would say that, yes, there are lessons that can be learned. And it's not just me. I think Professor Bojosi and others would agree with me on this.
That's good. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsay. Thank you very much for watching. That brings us to the end of our this week's edition of the Public Square. Hopefully you learned quite a lot from this wonderful lesson that we just had over the last hour. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramsay.
Well, it's a pleasure.